Our second panel this morning challenges us to think like scientists, and we'll talk about how to transform STEM teaching and learning. Let me first introduce our panel. Professor Carl Wyman is the founder of PhET Interactive Simulations and a professor of physics and education at Stanford University. He's the recipient of the 2020 Yidan Prize in Education Research, as well as the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2001. Dr. Kathy Perkins, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting at the coffee bar just now, directs PhET Interactive Simulations at University of Colorado Boulder and is a professor of physics education research in the Department of Physics. Dr. Ji-Peng Tan is a senior consultant to the World Bank's Education Global Practice, following her retirement from the bank as education advisor. Her recent work covers skills for growth, innovations in mathematics and science education, teacher development, and capacity building. Mr. Joseph Sangimana is the director of the MasterCard Foundation African Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. The center seeks to establish an African edtech ecosystem that will catalyze innovation in the use of ICT in learning and teaching to benefit African learners, educators, and policymakers. Mr. Zachariah M. Basu is the PhET ambassador in Africa. He leads PhET Interactive Simulations Africa's strategy and regional activities. In his previous engagement as an education advisor, he assisted over 3,000 teachers in improving the standard of math teaching and learning in Africa. Mr. Setang Ayalu is a lecturer of physics at Ambo University in Ethiopia. He has worked at the university for more than a decade, and he is one of 15 African PhET fellows selected in 2022 for his experience in the use of PhET's digital tools and effective pedagogies. Mr. Lemi Lachisa Cernessa is a graduate assistant of physics at Ambo University in Ethiopia and currently is an master's candidate in statistical physics at Ambo University. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Christopher Thomas, who is Director of Partnerships at the Yidan Prize Foundation and Social Entrepreneur in Residence at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. Now, before we start, once again, we encourage you to ask questions online at any time by scanning the QR code, whether you're online or the QR code on the back of your programs for those of you who are in the room with us, and we'll try and get through as many of those Q&A questions as possible. At this time, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Thomas. Thank you.
Carl, what a pleasure it has been to work with you since winning the Yidan Prize in 2020. I want to ask you if you can just give us a brief introduction to the origins of PhET Interactive Simulations and what goals you had in mind when you established this program. Thank you very much.
I want to say a little about the original goals and purpose of the PhET project, because PhET simulations are an educational tool, but they've turned out to be far more powerful tools than actually originally planned. When I first conceived of that, I was really thinking about how scientists view the world in terms of simplified models which they picture how things like atoms and light and electrons interact to produce the phenomena that we see. And I saw simulations as just a better way than conventional books and lectures to convey these scientific models to the students. Through the power of computer simulations, a learner could directly observe the dynamic behavior embodied in the models, how things are moving and changing, and seeing how if you change different variables, how that would change the behavior and interactions. And so it's just the idea that by conveying this behavior graphically, showing things happening on a computer screen, it made it much easier to understand. It removed these barriers of specialized language and equations that were present in sort of the traditional ways people had for presenting these ideas. So that original goal was all true, and we found that they worked, and that teachers embrace using PhET sims in a variety of ways to provide instruction based on these ideas. But what I did not originally appreciate was how the tool of the interactive simulations could actually transform the learning process itself in new ways. But this quickly became apparent to us once we started working with students as they were interacting with the simulations and seeing how they were interacting and exploring, taking on a much more active role in the learning process than happened in the normal conditions. Because now they could go in and they could change variables, they could see, explore, and discover on their own as to why things happened in different ways. And so they were asking questions and answering their questions using the simulation and by changing quantities, seeing what happened. So in many ways, exploring the phenomenon much the same way scientists do when they're trying to understand some new phenomena in the world. But this also meant that the students were adjusting the learning process to their own backgrounds and needs. They would deal with a level of complexity that they could make sense of, and if it was too messy, they'd go to something simpler. And so it's made the simulations effective for a much broader range of students and level and background than what we'd seen in anything else with a textbook or lecture could ever reach. And so this sort of active learning in which the learners themselves were developing new capabilities, new mental models through this active exercising and exploring is really a fundamental advance in learning, which is enabled by these PhET simulations. And ultimately, that's really the true power of, I think, behind them. And these kinds of sort of new mental capabilities, models you apply in new situations are just what's needed in the modern workforce to tackle and solve today's problems. So while the PhET simulations were really intended to be an educational tool to make it easier for students to learn scientific concepts, they've really gone beyond that by enabling this powerful new form of actual learning by students. And of course, the virtue of the digital technology has made this now accessible to very large numbers.
Kathy, we just heard from Carl about the origin and the purposes of PhET. Can you help us visualize what PhET looks like in practice?
Yeah, I would love to take a few moments to show PhET and really bring Carl's words to life. So I'm going to share my screen. The only way to understand PhET is to really see a PhET simulation in action. So here we're at the PhET website. You can start exploring by just clicking on Explore Your Simulations. Filter, I'm going to do alphabetical. You can see that we have over 100 simulations here at our website. I'm going to begin by demonstrating build an atom. So in this simulation, atoms were one of the things Carl mentioned. In this simulation, it opens with this exploratory space that invites students in to make changes and discover how atoms work. So they can just pull in a proton into the atom shell, neutrons, and as they're doing this interaction, they really can discover for themselves a lot of the fundamental ideas around atoms. So for instance, they can see that only protons change the element name. They can open up these other measures over here to experiment and see that neutrons and protons impact the mass number, discover that electrons impact the charge, again, protons impact the charge. So it's really this open exploratory space where through interaction and immediate feedback, students are able to experiment and discover and turn that learning that would have been passive into a very engaging, active activity where now the knowledge belongs to the student, right? Before, to learn about atoms, they're invisible, they're tiny, you can't play with them in the real world, at least at the school level. And so this computer environment changes that equation. Now students can play and they can discover what's going on. Another simulation that I wanted to mention is circuit construction kit. This design of the simulation is quite different. It's more of a construction open play space where now students can build any circuit they want as they connect the wires and create a complete circuit. They get a visualization of the electrons moving through the circuit, again, making the invisible invisible. In this context, we can relate it to everyday life. We do that whenever we can. And this is really a good example of a simulation that that serves that goal that Carl was saying, where simulations are just such unique tools because they can address learning goals across so many different grade levels. This simulation is used very often with elementary students. You might prompt how, make the light bulb light. In that case, the student can explore, discover that they need to make a complete circuit. In contrast, at the college level, this simulation also gets a lot of use, digging into what makes the complexities of sort of circuits in series, circuits in parallel, what happens when you have bulbs of different resistance. The learning goals are very expansive, and this simulation itself is used more than 15 million times. The teacher can adopt its use to the learning goals, to the students, to the resources that they have. And that's really critical for, realizing the true potential of the interactive simulations. It's really the simulation, the flexibility, the feedback, the scaffolding provided in it, plus the activity, plus the teacher, all coming together to create a really rich learning environment. That doesn't happen on its own. It requires training teachers, understanding the different advanced pedagogies that can use with simulations. And that's really something that I think we'll hear more about from Zach.
Thank you, Kathy. That's really exciting. I think to my own education of trying to imagine these concepts, but just by reading a book or by limited time in a lab, and this is an entirely different world. Really terrific. Zach, as FET ambassador for Africa, can you tell us a bit about what do you feel FET brings to the communities that you're trying to serve, the teachers and the students that you're trying to serve, and how do you see them adapting FET to use in their own contexts?
Thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful question. A bit of context: teachers in the region are grappling with how to support good learning with relatively limited resources. There is massive shortage of trained teachers across the different academic learning levels. There are no science labs, and where there are labs, there is no sufficient supply of consumables. Kathy was just showing the electric circuit, and there are so many labs on the continent that do not have batteries to do experiments on circuits. And lastly, our classrooms are characterized by very poor pedagogical practices. There's a lot of rote learning and memorization in the classroom. FET does provide an opportunity, and it is a solution to some of these challenges. For example, FET is eliminating barriers to science learning by providing this powerful, free online and offline interactive tool that Kathy has just shown us that enables learners to think like scientists. There are teachers who are using FET simulations in math and science instruction to accomplish a variety of learning goals. And they use these FET simulations as virtual science labs. They use them in classroom activities. They use them as demonstrations. And also they allow students to go and do their homeworks at home. And these FET simulations give an opportunity to students to investigate things on their own. Just to come to your second question about how this simulation, how we are supporting the teachers across the continent to scale the use of these simulations, I would like to say that teachers can transform learning in classroom with the right support and the training that they need. And FET is doing this through 3 activities. The first activity is through the FET Fellowship. And thanks to the support from the Yidan Prize Foundation, we have identified 15 African practicing teachers from 12 different countries across different academic levels, and we call them FET Fellows. So they use FET simulations in their own teaching, and they are committed to improving science and math education in their countries. They are the change agents in their countries, and we are learning from these teachers about how FET can work in their context and how do we support the region's needs in terms of just how we can be able to implement the FET simulations in their countries. Then they also work across the continent to help the other teachers to use the FET simulations in the most effective way in their teaching. They are engaged in professional leadership growth. Some of them are increasing accessibility and impact of FET simulations through face-to-face trainings. Some of them have organized virtual workshops on the effective teaching pedagogies of hundreds of other teachers in their respective countries. Secondly, we are also supporting teachers on the continent through what we call FET virtual workshops. And FET is offering virtual workshops with partners like teacher associations and math associations in Lesotho, University of Rwanda, NGOs in rural Nigeria. And these workshops are professional development opportunities for educators across the continent to learn about FET resources and pedagogies. The participants explore how they can find relevant simulations to their lessons and embed the simulations in their own teaching. These teachers also learn strategies of how to use FET in circumstances where they are presenting a simulation in front of a very large class size. It is very typical in Africa to find a teacher standing in front of students, and then this teacher has got 80, 100 students in front of them. So they learn how to do whole class strategies with this group of students, how to get students to answer predictive questions, and just employ strategies that use the FET simulations in these circumstances. So I would say that FET is really committed to expanding the use of these FET simulations, and we are very committed to reducing the barriers that the continent experiences in terms of science teaching and learning.
Thank you, Zach. I just had the honor of spending a few days with you and several hundred African educators, where you and several FET fellows demonstrated the power of FET, and you could feel the excitement in the room, the potential of this to transform the way people are teaching and to bring new resources into the classroom. So thank you very much. Tetkin, you were one of the first FET fellows in Africa, and one of the early users of FET. Can you tell us a bit about how you use FET to change the way you teach, and maybe a little hint of what changes you observe in the students as they use FET?
I think it is good to give a little background first about my teaching methodology before using the FET software, so as to address the question. Actually, I am a lecturer of physics at Ambo University in Ethiopia. And during my teaching career at the university, I noticed that there was a gap in doing laboratory activities due to shortage of equipment and lack of well-trained laboratory technicians. And thus, the teaching learning process was not well supported by laboratory activities at that time. Hence, what I was doing was, I was actually looking for a solution to alleviate the problem. And I came to know that FET software was accessible for free and even without the internet. Therefore, I started thinking on how I can align the FET simulation with our curriculum, and started teaching my lessons using the software in a way that was convenient to me. And fortunately, in May 2022, I was selected as one of the 15 African FET fellows and got the opportunity to be trained on how to effectively use and implement the FET resources in the classroom, and also on how to become an effective STEM leader. And in the past 6 months of the learning phase of the fellowship, we learned a lot on good practices of active learning methods using PhET simulations, like interactive lecture demonstration, whole class strategy, and also concept questions method. And these methods helped me to make a paradigm shift. That's to mean that to change my teaching methodology from teacher-centered into student-centered method. So as to give you an insight on what I have been doing, I will give you one instance. For example, while I was teaching projectile motion to undergraduate first-year students, what I do was I initially ask questions to the students, and I allow the students to make predictions on the question. And then I demonstrate the situation using the PhET software, and I involve the students to make a direct measurement of some parameters like range and maximum height of the projectile. And also I allow them to collect some data from the simulation, as well as I asked them to measure the time of flight of the projectile using their smartphones. And after that, the students will make a data analysis by calculating for the unknown parameters. And finally, they will compare their simulation experiment with that of their initial predictions, as well as with the theory. And in this way, I usually try to make the learning activity to be student-centered, in which students have an active role in the teaching learning process. And this has created a good motivation and eagerness on the students' ability to learn the lesson. And as a teacher, I also benefited a lot from the contents of the teaching materials, like the teacher tips, which are available on the PhET software. Since this PhET software is very essential for STEM education in developing countries like Ethiopia, I am translating the PhET resources to our local language, Amharic, so that the teachers in our country, as well as the students, can access them in the language very easily. And currently, I am also designing a project on PhET interactive simulation experiments for school-level science laboratory activities. And in this project, it is planned that we plan to train STEM teachers on how to use the PhET resources. And in the meantime, it will be a good opportunity to create an awareness on the use of PhET simulations for classroom STEM lessons. And upon a successful implementation of this project, I strongly believe that the project will bring a positive impact on the quality of STEM education in Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Setkin. Lemmy, you were, I believe, Setkin's student. Can you give us a bit from your perspective about how PhET changed the way you learn and maybe how well you learn?
As you know, I'm a lab technician of physics department in Hamburg University. My experience on the PhET, I have some experience. One, as first, I can easily open the PhET software as taught by the teacher, and simply I can do some simulation simply as one of a student according to my advisor or my teacher taught me. And another, according to the physics department, I understand a science using PhET without experimental material. Especially in our university, there is no enough material to do some experiment. Then we can use for this efficiency material, this PhET simulation. Even I helped my classmates to use this PhET easy, because some students come from any village not familiar with the computer, also with this simulation, and during our lab section, I can help to do this simulation and to do this opening and using this computer and the simulation as a student. As per my department, there are some experiments that I have been studying and still teaching. For example, according to our department, if we haven't some device to use experiment, we can use this phase simulation. Example for mechanics, projectile motion, as my teacher Satan mentioned. And also from electricity and magnetism, series circuits, parallel circuits, and also from wave and optics, magnification of convex lens, and from mechanics, simple pendulum, Hooke's law. We can use simply by using this fate simulation, because we haven't, for this experiment, we have not enough device or material. And we can also use for another experiment. Another one, as one of a student, I changed the direction of my study, especially in the laboratory. I have changed the direction I was learning and what I was learning exactly, because before the way I learned theory was practical and invisible. But now, since I started learning fate with a few experiments, I was experiencing science now, I understand. Example, especially in a natural science, as a student, we can't see when we learn a theory, especially when the teacher is teaching about flow of charge, we can't see. As a student, I understand with this phase simulation, when charge flow, I noticed what I didn't see before. And I noticed when photoelectric flow, especially in photoelectric effect, when some lights come from source and pass through some metal, some electron is ejected from the metal. This is a theory, but we can see the electron which emit from this metal. And also I used to look at sign, and now that I started using fate exactly the same. So using fate made me understand the lesson easier. Generally, the benefits of using this fate for the student is that it simply make as the hidden science that the student cannot see and explain some scientific mysteries. So hard science, when we learn in the class, they have some mysteries. But by this phase simulation, we can understand, we can see some flow of charge, some flow of electron, proton. We can understand simply. Really, to speak, when we learn this experiment, we are funny, because as we learn in the class, we cannot imagine when we see practically when electron is moved to one place to another place, we can find and we can learn simply. And in fact, when we do experiment with the fate, we admire a science, especially hard science. It's difficult to see with the natural eye. This is mastery in a science. But using fate, the level, the mastery here, which made us very happy and fun.
Joseph, MasterCard Foundation is one of the biggest funders of education in Africa and the most innovative funders of education in Africa. Can you give us a little insight into your strategy for developing education in the region, and tell us a bit about what interests you about FET?
I think my colleagues who have spoken before me have actually made the case of why it is important to support the FET interactive simulations. Kathy's demo shows indeed how these simulations bring to life the learning process. Zach, as well as my colleague Stegen, described how these simulations are actually used in a context of Africa, in a context of teaching and learning. I think all this kind of goes to show how really it is important to have an active way of learning. And I think it's very crucial in strengthening education on the continent. So our support to the education really goes to our very own mission. We believe that every person deserves an opportunity to learn and prosper. Everyone, no matter their starting point in life, deserve an opportunity to succeed. And it is our belief that access to education, as well as to other resources such as skill development, would actually provide that chance. So that's why we invest heavily in education. The foundation, through its scholars program, has actually supported to date about 40,000 young people in completing their studies and transitioning into work. And it's planned that by the year 2030, that support would have extended to about 100,000. And so we believe really that the foundation is the foundation upon which even our Young Africa strategy is built. For those who are not familiar with our Young Africa work strategy, it is a strategy that has for objective to enable 30 million young Africans to obtain dignified and fulfilling work by the year 2030. And this is going to focus on all young Africans, but particularly on young women. And we believe that for that to happen, we need to build a strong education background to support this work. And so we seek opportunity to find organization or programs that actually really improving the learning outcomes and invest in those programs. That's how we came about the FED simulations, and that's why we support the FED simulations. And we really believe that as we move towards inside the 21st century, it's going to be crucial in investing in education technology. FED simulations is an example of those products. And so through our Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning, we actually support a number of programs, FED being one of them, but there is others that are actually have been produced by African companies. And through that, we connect them with government institutions, we connect them with schools, we connect them with learners. And the hope is that by tapping to all these resources, we're going to see an increase in learning. We're going to see an increase in access to the quality and relevant education. And overall, we will see increased employment in young people. So this is why we support the FED simulations and other products that we have listed above.
I love the goal of, or starting from the point where we believe everyone has the right, or deserves the right to learn and prosper and succeed. Jipeng, can you give us a little bit of insight into how STEM comes into the policy discussions and why you believe it is so important for the future of young people?
Thank you very much, Chris. Let me start to answer your question by recalling Richard Easterlin's 1981 article on why isn't the whole world developed. He concluded that science and modern education separated faster growing countries from the rest. Well, since 1981, science and its application in technology have become ever more deeply embedded in our lives. We have only to consider the cell phone. It is now a basic tool for billions of people. Yet not too long ago, its computing power used to reside in machines the size of a large room. Such dramatic developments have reshaped life in all areas, so much so that people call our era the age of the fourth industrial revolution. This revolution explains why STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are at the core of what Easterlin called modern education in his article. In the 4IR age, even minimal knowledge of STEM can make a real difference in the lives of individuals. In Kerala, India, for example, fishermen have petitioned the government for ham radios and GPS equipment to obtain timely information on the weather and their location while out fishing at sea. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that schools closed and many families looked to online learning to fill a gap. However, unfamiliarity with digital technologies made it hard for some parents to offer effective help to their children. For young people entering the labor market, a STEM education is often a ticket to better jobs and more pay. STEM education comes into its own when we consider its implications for countries. Many factors determine a country's rate of economic growth, among them a workforce with critical mass of human capital in the STEM fields. Countries such as Korea and Singapore, for example, have been investing in STEM education since the 1960s and have reaped the economic benefits. Korean companies like Samsung and LG are household names across the globe today. In Singapore, a country of just 5.5 million people, now supplies 20% of the world's chip-making equipment. STEM education enabled both countries to move up the value chain and improve the standard of living for their citizens. Well, STEM skills are especially pertinent in Africa because such skills are still scarce today. Increasing the pool of learners with the preparation to pursue and succeed in STEM programs is thus a critical priority for their growth strategies. Resources like FET can make an important contribution to the success of this endeavor. So these are the reasons why I am such an advocate for STEM education, and I'm so happy that educators in Africa are discovering the availability of this wonderful resource called FET. Thank you.
Always remember Carl saying that the decisions that we need to live our lives well increasingly involve questions of science and technology, from how to protect ourselves against climate change to how to protect ourselves against pandemic, indeed how to succeed in the workplace. And I want to thank all of you for a fascinating discussion and for bringing us this tool and helping people realize the power of it and helping it spread in education systems throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to Dr. Thomas for leading the discussions. At this time, please welcome Dr. Kathy Perkins, Mr. Zachariah M. Basu, and Dr. Christopher Thomas on stage for our live Q&A.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just start off with Kathy. You're the director of FET Interactive Simulations, but you've been with FET for almost 2 decades, I believe, from the beginning.
January will be 2 decades.
Yeah, congratulations, and thank you. Charles started his talk this morning about talking about how good teachers affected his life, and I think we learned through both panels that it takes a lot of work to make a good teacher, and this tool that you're providing is a real boost to a lot of science teachers. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes into FET, what goes into all that work that goes into making a FET simulation? And very specifically, I have a question from the audience about how you incorporate sort of learning from experimental errors and limitations on equipment into the design of FET.
All right, well, that's a very interesting question. Thanks for whoever submitted it. So I'll start with just the basics of creating a simulation, and then I'll dive deeper into how we can address issues of uncertainty in experimental design. So we start the design of a simulation with articulating the learning goals. And here we really also look to the education research that's being done in the specific disciplines. So we look at what are student learning difficulties at a particular educational level in a particular topic. There's quite a bit of disciplinary-based education research happening right now. And so we look for those spaces where students are having challenges and also where the tool of an interactive simulation the affordances of that tool can really benefit students' learning. So spaces where you can make the invisible visible, as Lemmy was talking about, spaces where dynamic feedback makes a big difference, where as the students interact with a particular content space, they see an immediate response from the simulation that can help them build their understanding of the relationships and in that way discover the concepts for themselves and bring that learning back into their discussion with students or with classroom. And secondly, when we actually go to design and develop a simulation, it really takes expertise across a interdisciplinary group of people. So we bring in education researchers, we bring in specialists that focus on the pedagogy, teachers who are in the classroom, and then we have experts in simulation design, and of course our software engineers. We kind of, after we have a working prototype, of course we want to see how students interact with the simulation, so we go deep into bringing the simulation in front of a student, having them do an individual interview with us where we look at how they interact with the simulation. We know a simulation is working when we see them sort of lean into the computer, engage with what's on the screen. It's a think aloud interview, so we ask them to say what's in their head. So if we see them asking questions, we see them making those connections. When that happens, we know that the simulation is ready to bring into the classroom to support inquiry-based learning. I will now turn to the question of adding uncertainty and how a simulation can address ideas of uncertainty in experimental design. We recently actually received a new grant to explore that space. And one of our simulations, the projectile motion simulation, we're adding uncertainty into the projectile. So now you can actually play around with what happens when you change, when you add different levels of uncertainty to, say, the launch angle. And it's just making the simulation even richer. So while historically the simulations have been a very accurate version of what happens, we're exploring ideas about how you can better teach experimental uncertainty through the use of simulations as well.
I think it makes it richer, but it makes it more fun too.
Yes.
Zach, if I can turn to you, as you're FET ambassador, but you're also a longtime science educator. How has FET changed the way you teach? And how has it changed the way students learn? And I have a specific question from somebody in the audience about whether or not students can dive deeper into a FET experiment and learn at their own level. Can you do that? Can you encourage that in your classroom?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for that question, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'll give you a story about 2012 when I was teaching physics at high school, and I was teaching a very specific concept on Hooke's law, where you sort of put masses on a spring and then they see how the spring changes. So 70 students in front of me, and I would go to a class. I have this, Hooke's law with me, and I just take it from my head or from the textbook, and then transfer it to learners. And then after the lesson, I had this student who came to me, and he was like, what you're saying about proportionality, I don't see how it relates with my fishing hook and my fishing rod, because when I go to fishing, it doesn't matter whether I fish a big fish or a small fish. The length of the string is the same. And I realized that what this student was telling me was to really transform the way I teach a concept. And he gave me a very interesting perspective. He said, at home, when my mother teaches me how to cook, what she does is she asks me to cook lunch or to cook, dinner. So I have to think through what is it that I'm going to cook, get the ingredients, and then cook, and then we have a meal. And then if I have much more salt in, then I know that next time I need to reduce the salt. So that gave me an insight, and I started to think about like, how can I change my own teaching so that my teaching is focused on the students' learning as opposed to me just transferring knowledge. And that's when I came across the PhET simulations, and I realized these beautiful interactive resources that instead of me just passing information to learners, I'll give them opportunities to experiment with these simulations, to create their own experiments, to investigate what is happening when they change variables. When I'm teaching the concept of things that affect resistance in a wire, for example, I will set up a scenario, an experiment scenario, and then students will go in and they will change this, they will change the radius, for example, of the wire, and they will see how changing the cross-sectional area of the wire is affecting the resistance and the movement of electrons within the wire.
And how is that, having this tool, the students, how has it helped them become more engaged, and can they do you find them diving deeper into topics than they would have with a standard curriculum?
Yes, so I'll also give you the example that Kathy was giving of them connecting wires in an electric circuit. So if you go to a lab with the wires, students will connect the wires and they will see the lighting, but they will not like really be understanding what is happening within the wires. But with the PhET simulations, they're able to see the movement of those electrons and what is affecting the movement of those electrons. And they begin to ask even much deeper questions and really understanding the concept from a conceptual level as opposed to just the top physical level.
And do you, both of you, there's a large section on the PhET website about research about PhET. Can you give us any conclusions about how learning outcomes might have improved with students that use PhET versus those who don't?
Sure, so I'll just build off the example that Zach was talking about. So sort of pretty early on, we did an experiment at University of Colorado Boulder where we had, of course, students in the introductory physics labs engaging in labs, and one of them was circuits. And so we wanted to test the effectiveness of the circuit simulation on their learning. And so we had a group engage in the circuit simulation, and then we had a different group of students engage as they would with the traditional equipment. And as an assessment, we actually had both sets of students build a circuit with physical equipment and then explain how it was working. And actually, the students that used the simulation, what we saw is during the lab, they were able to do many more experiments and do them faster because it's just easier to use the simulation. And then they were actually able to transfer that learning quite readily to the physical circuit, build the simulation in less time than the students who had worked with the physical equipment, and they did a better job of explaining how that circuit was learning. So I think the way that we see it is that they were able to build that conceptual model of how a circuit was how circuits work conceptually, and then in that way they were able to more successfully build and describe the bottom line circuit. And then we also found that even months later that group scored better on the final exam questions that were related to circuits. So it was a lasting learning experience, even though it was quite limited to
so it was
one
deeper
lab.
learning and measured learning in the exam. Good. And another question from the audience, that the metaverse is becoming very popular. So how will technology and AR and VR improve, or how are you thinking about PhET in this new world? Will the technologies make it even better, more interactive?
So, so I'm not sure about the metaverse, but one of the things that we look at is research around education technologies, and there's quite actually a bit of research in virtual tools and in interactive tools like PhET that shows that if you add extraneous complexity, that it actually decreases learning. Extraneous complexity. So like, you know, if you look at our simulations, they're relatively simple. Like our projectile motion simulation has a very simplified background. It doesn't have, you know, we don't want to distract students from, you know, from the concepts that they're trying to learn. So we want them to tie it to the real world. We want to give them those connections. But when you make the visuals too complex, then that can often decrease the learning because they're focused on things that, you know, sort of decreases their attention from what they need to be attending. So you want to make it engaging, interactive. So when I look at something like the metaverse, that's a question in my mind, you know, we go 3D when we need to go 3D for the pedagogy, but we don't go 3D for everything because it's not needed for student learning.
And maybe, Zach, you're working with a lot of big institutions and governments to try to introduce PhET at scale. What are the sort of first steps that you talk about with institutions about adopting PhET, about what are the key decisions they need to make up front, and how do you get this working at a large scale in a school system?
Yeah, thank you. So one is for educators to think about ease of access, especially to everyone. And with the PhET simulations, they are, you know, accessible online. They are also accessible offline for contexts that do not have internet access. Also with the PhET simulations, you don't need to really like create an account and have a password because that takes time, you know, out of, you know, teaching time and learning time. And then also how they can share these resources. So for example, with the PhET simulation, a teacher in Botswana can, you know, download a simulation on his or her smartphone and then send via WhatsApp the HTML files to a teacher in rural Nigeria, and then they can just easily use it. The second thing is the existing infrastructure within a system. For example, for countries like Kenya, you have schools that have infrastructure in schools. They have computers or tablets, but they are not being used. So government would think about like how do they take advantage of existing infrastructure in schools to be able to take advantage of the PhET simulations. And then the third thing is the capacity building around the use of the PhET simulations. The simulations are very easy to use. Once you have it, once it's in front of a student, you don't really need to give instructions to students on how they can, you know, use it. It is very intuitive. But also just to build the capacity of teachers on how they can really use them in classroom effectively. So we do like design with the teachers. So the teachers have access to the PhET simulations, but we give them an opportunity to design lessons based on the simulations that are existing. And then they share those you know, designed activities on the website, and other teachers can also have access to those resources and get inspired on how to use those PhET simulations. And then lastly, just thinking about like how do the PhET simulations align to the national curriculums. And teachers get to think through, to look at the simulations, look at the learning objective and the learning goal that they want to achieve, and then select a simulation that aligns to that learning goal, and they use it in a classroom setup. And most of the time you find teachers saying, oh, it reduced my work. I didn't have to do a lot of work to really be able to use it in a classroom setup.
And Kathy, what if an educator is interested in using PhET? What resources are available on the website or in terms of support from PhET interactive simulations to them?
Yeah, so as I think Zach was mentioning, we do have lessons and activities available for each of the simulations already aligned. It's a it's one of the spaces where we encourage educators around the world that are building lessons to contribute. So those are all available on the website, as are the simulations. But learning how to use the simulation effectively in the classroom is a very key point. So the simulation, it's not magical. You don't give the simulation to a student and that's it, they're learning, right? It's about how you create that learning environment, about the simulation plus the activity plus the teacher facilitation. And so with funding from the Yidan Prize, we've been able to really deepen our work within teacher professional development, and we've built out a virtual workshop that's a 35 to 40 hour experience for teachers. And it can be done on their own. If they just go to the website and work through, there's activities and videos and lessons. But as well, we offer facilitated versions of that, where we bring together cohorts of teachers and basically have touch points throughout the virtual workshop where they're coming together, they're digesting what they've learned, they're sharing, and that really deepens the learning experience. So we've been very excited to have those opportunities to work on professional development.
That's terrific. I've been lucky to sit in a few sessions, and they've been really both incredibly informative and entertaining too. So I think it's something that people pick up naturally with you, and you've done a great job. And thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for all of your questions. And
thank you.
That's it, yeah.